Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from DJ Sabrina the Teenage DJ, Destiny. You know, if I'm being totally honest, I wasn't really expecting to be making another dedicated video on this artist. DJ Sabrina the Teenage DJ is someone who, in the past, I might have said I generally enjoyed, but I don't know if I could say I ever really completely got. Right at the end of 2020, she really made a lot of waves within the particular music circles I follow when she came out with her album Charmed, a sprawling house and future funk adjacent project inspired by the aesthetics of, like, cheesy Disney Channel tier sitcoms, and most specifically Sabrina the Teenage Witch, as well as like that late 90s and early 2000s house scene that birthed stuff like Milky's Just the Way You Are. So many people I follow are going nuts over that project. Several of my direct reviewing colleagues were giving it huge glowing praise, and it even became a big enough deal that Fantano covered it, albeit not quite as glowing as everyone else was. I obviously ended up also reviewing it myself, link in the description or card or whatever, and I stand by all my thoughts as expressed in that video. Charmed is a good album. There are a few moments in that project which stand among some of the best house and future funk material I'd ever heard in that scene, like, full stop. That album gave me about an hour of incredibly addicting and soul-lifting house and disco grooves that carried a very similar energy to the most banger-heavy moments of the Avalanche's first two records, and very much gave me the magical experience that everyone was promising I'd be getting. I stand by this collection of 10 tracks that I've kept around, adding up to a properly great album, and one that I've even semi-regularly come back to in the years since it dropped. The trouble, of course, is that Charmed is not a 1-hour album, it's a 3-hour album. And not only that, it's a single 3-hour continuous mix of basically the exact same ideas repeated over and over, with not that much in the way of variety. And when it did break from the formula, it typically wasn't that great either. The hour I decided to keep isn't altogether in the same place, it's those 10 tracks scattered throughout the full list of 31. And I wouldn't say any of the remaining 21 tracks were bad in a vacuum, but they all ranged from nice and pleasant in a fairly unremarkable way to just okay. And having to add all of that up into a single package that features no obvious stopping points and seems to be actively tempting people to try and sit through all of it at once, that was a recipe for headaches and tedium. I'd say it really speaks to how high those highest high points are when I still came out of the album with positive enough feelings to let it off with a 7.3 out of 10. But that's also why I say I never fully got DJ Sabrina, despite liking that album. Fantano and I were very much in the minority of people who found that album's length to be an active impediment on our enjoyment. Pretty much everyone else I saw talking about the album was perfectly content to keep the entire thing in its full unbroken whole, and felt that it so consistently delivered hit after hit that the formula never grew stale for them throughout that entire 3-hour running time. And obviously, if that is your perspective, that's great, and I don't want to take that away from anyone, but I just couldn't envision getting to that point myself. And it really felt weird to me that this was the case, given that DJ Sabrina was otherwise the kind of artist that I'd think would specifically appeal to someone like me, as can be seen by my typical bleeding enthusiasm for the band on my t-shirt today. And my feelings there would probably also apply to her other albums, which basically had the exact same idea of super long and sprawling house albums with Disney Channel aesthetics that all kind of hit me in the same way from all I'd previewed through. I hope that maybe with a shorter album I could possibly connect with her stuff more deeply, and when she dropped the merely hour-and-a-half album Bewitched last year, I thought that could be it. But while that album didn't have any of the overwhelmingly tedious aspects of Charmed, it also lacked that album's soaring high points. It just delivered more of the same formula pleasantly enough, annoying me a lot less but also failing to stick with me longer term in the same way. After covering that project into Some Stuff I Missed segment, I figured that maybe DJ Sabrina at best might be better suited to that format and maybe kept at arm's length for me. I was content to just say that maybe your stuff just wasn't really my thing as much as everyone else's. And when I saw yet another meaty album here coming out that was even longer than any previous DJ Sabrina project that I know of, at nearly 4 hours long, and it got similar glowing buzz from all the same people who I saw get the most excited about Charmed, I figured, well, probably give it a shot once and see if it has some standouts worth keeping. Now, on the surface, absolutely nothing has changed from the usual DJ Sabrina formula on this latest album. It's another 4 hours of the exact same bright and flashy and uplifting mixes of house and disco and whatnot that we've all fully come to expect, with all the same 90s and 2000s sitcom nostalgia aesthetics coloring every moment. And yes, once again, it's a single continuous mix. 4 hours without any obvious stopping points, and possibly even more seamlessly flowing than any of the other projects I'd heard from her previously. But as I was getting through this album, something started to hit different. I started to run into more and more tracks that felt like standouts to me, and the tracks that maybe didn't stand out to me as much felt fewer and more far between. It became surprisingly rare for there to be like more than one lesser point in a row. If there was a track that I was less hot on, there would almost always be a bigger standout coming around to just immediately follow it up, preventing the album from ever entirely losing me. By the halfway mark of this album, I was like, okay, hang on, I might actually be getting the experience out of this album that my reviewing colleagues were actually getting out of Charmed. And by the time I reached the finish line and made it through the end of the 41st track, I was like, no, yeah, I think that stands. I thought Destiny was actually properly great as a whole, and I felt like this was the experience that I had been promised and that I was hoping to get all along when I was first made aware of her at the end of 2020. Not to say I think this album wouldn't have also once again benefited from some editing. There are a couple of lulls in the track listing, especially around the stretch, like around the 3-hour mark. I would definitely say the first half of this album was stronger than the second as well. Taking breaks will absolutely be necessary. But I don't feel like those lower points are nearly as much a weight on the album as the filler on Charmed was. I did still come out of the full 4-hour experience thinking that was great, and even if I were to edit it down, I think I'd at worst probably still end up with at least a 3-hour album anyway. I think I might be starting to actually get DJ Sabrina the Teenage DJ, guys. Now, when it comes to individual tracks, when I reviewed Charmed, I kind of just jumped around the track listing a lot in a way to organize my thoughts on an otherwise fairly disorganized album. But with this one, I feel like I might just be able to go through them in order, so I'm just gonna do that, fuck it. So this album opens up with the 8-minute Honey, which is a comparatively lower key track for DJ Sabrina, kind of starting out with some simple acoustic guitar strumming, although gradually building into the usual well-layered stomping mixes of 2000s house, filling the audio spectrum from various different guitar textures and filtered vocal samples, to even a few sax solos thrown in for good measure. It's definitely what I would expect out of a DJ Sabrina production. At first I wasn't really sure if this was really like a huge showstopper intro to ride home about. Although unlike Next to Me from Charmed, which I still have that kind of underwhelmed feeling on, this one grew on me, like, immediately on my second listen to the album. It does certainly set the tone for the good vibes, the emotionality, and I guess the average level of energy you'll get throughout the album. It's really well detailed without ever becoming so cluttered to the point of becoming borderline white noise. It has a number of good tunes flying past you at the same time. Out of the openers of the 3 DJ Sabrina projects I've heard and covered, this is easily my favorite of them. After 2 interludes which are so closely intertwined with the opener I'm not sure why they're even separated or given names at all, we then hit the second proper track, Brave, another cut I was pretty ambivalent on when I first heard, but grew on me later. This track has a little more energy to it and pays off in some, like, electro house beats with some bright synth chords and vocal chops that give me a very similar feel to something that might have shown up on, like, Zircon's Getaway EP a decade ago. Although I don't know if I'd even call that track a major favorite or standout here. The real point at which this album started to properly grab me and clue me into its true power level was For Now and Forever. It's a pretty standard polished disco pop mix with lots of catchy vocal samples like most other DJ Sabrina productions. Although right around the 1.5-minute mark, it feels like the entire track just really kicks into high gear with a more grooving bass line instead of house beats suddenly popping in and seemingly just doubling the energy level of the entire track on the spot. There's a lot of competition for what might be my single favorite track on this album, but I think this one might be it. It just goes so triumphantly hard, it raises the album to a new height not yet reached before, and pulls me right into it every goddamn time. Absolutely fantastic track here. From there, we switch off for a little while between tracks that I think are solid favorites and tracks I think are merely pretty good without being standouts. Garden Party falls in the latter category. It has a lot of good stomping beats, punchy horn sections, a cool change-up halfway through, and a really nice heartfelt soul sample outro, which is, quite frankly, easily the best part of the track. Although that cut doesn't really have a strong hook to it, it isn't quite able to match the energy of the track it immediately follows. Meanwhile, Got To Be falls in the former category. Despite carrying a lot of the exact same stomping house beat patterns as before, it just happens to carry a lot more dramatic weight through its choice in sampled hooks, getting a little bit of the same energy out of this one as like the Avalanche's Live at Domino's. It's Still Me is a very good track that isn't a standout. All the mixes of breathy vocal choruses on this one, while nice, don't make for among the most ear-catching hooks here. Maybe that might have changed if I'd heard this one as a standalone single before its release, though I wasn't listening to any of those pre-album singles. But then we hit something new, which fittingly marks a little bit of a new turn for the album, and has a different, more subtle energy compared to everything that came before. The deeper auto-tune samples about how the world ain't right, going over the much more stripped-back synth pad progressions here, makes for a much more intimate, comforting, and vulnerable moment for the album that we hadn't really heard yet up to this point, without ever going in the usual more over-the-top direction that DJ Sabrina tracks usually go in. And I'd argue this also marks the beginning of the best stretch of the album, carrying on for the entire following, hour and a half. Every track in this stretch, from Something New through to, I'm gonna say I Know It's Stupid, either delivers a little bit of a twist on the usual DJ Sabrina formula, or just happens to deliver a really good hook that acts as one of the best iterations of said formula on display. Because Love significantly lowers the tempo and tries to get something more epic out of its typically euphoric heights, kinda like if I Want You to Know from Charmed was a come down instead of an explosive raising of stakes. Also with less good a hook, but never mind that. Get Over It acts as a payoff to this more emotionally vulnerable mini-trilogy of tracks, raising the energy level back up to the usual level, but building itself for a lot more around these very pretty cascading synth pads. And then we just get 4 tracks in a row which happen to be big standouts for me on the merits of their hooks alone. Will You Be Mine, I'll Always Be There, I'm Giving You Up, and the title track. All stick to these standard DJ Sabrina formulas, but just all really deliver on those samples that stick in the head really easily and really hit on their deeper emotional levels in their own way. I would keep thinking that I'm gonna get a track that's not gonna stand out in this part, and yet all of them really resonated and just kept hitting those euphoric heights over and over in a way that still felt equally satisfying every time. Like, the title track almost didn't hit on first listen because I didn't think I was going to get this many standouts in a row, but by second listen I quickly realized, no, all of them are that good. And the title track might even be the best of those 4. Also, side note, I do find it pretty funny how a track that's called "Oh, I'll Always Be There" is immediately followed by a track called "I'm Giving You Up." Those hormonal teenage romances and their ridiculous volatility that can make feelings that feel like they'd be forever one day turn on a dime the next day, am I right? But after the title track, we get a bunch more tracks in a row that become standouts thanks to the way they change up the usual formula. When the track Invincible Something to Hold On To started, it really caught me off guard. It was this totally different, way more mechanical blend of electro-industrial beats with robotic voices and stuff. Some of the usual filtered vocal samples and disco beats do come in to still fit with the usual DJ Sabrina production style, but it ends up having much more of this synthetic I Feel Love-esque energy to it, which I thought was really cool. And then to completely contrast that track, we get The End, which is just a super straightforward stripped-back ballad with a traditional female lead vocalist singing regular verses and choruses. The tune behind it is great, the vocalist really sells it, and the sax solos are again a really nice touch. But to completely contrast that track's striking simplicity, we get I'm Taken, which is anything but simple. It feels like all the ingredients from the previous track just start to fall apart and go out of sync with each other, the skittering drum machines and blubbering bass lines adding up to this really weird and off-kilter IDM kind of mix that ends up also building up to an equally off-kilter but still really triumphant euphoric payoff with the usual layered vocal sampling and much thicker drumming that kind of resembles a drum and bass workout. I was really not expecting a track like that to show up on an album like this, and it very much floored me. My Own is another more traditional vocal track that has much more of a cloudy indie pop rock kind of flavor to it with a few late 80s synthwave touches around the edges. Not quite as immediate as the end, but certainly hits very well. And after that, we hit another really interesting turn I wasn't expecting, as He's My Baby ends up going in more like a lounge, jazzy, down-tempo kind of direction. Lots of soothing electric piano chords with deep trombone and piano accompaniment to really further that effect, really giving off some, like, Larry Heard type energy. Y'all know me, I'm always going to be happy to hear a turn for the jazzier and loungier like this, and that sound is done really well once again. Another really refreshing addition. Out of Nothing does away with the jazzier touches and returns to a mix of acoustic guitar-backed high-gloss pop with flashier vocal samples that fits more with the usual sound of the album and doesn't stand out quite as much. Although the segue into this track is one of the smoothest ones, and the way the beats keep shuffling away at the exact same pace makes this cut almost feel like a part 2 to directly build upon the ideas of the previous track, which is pretty neat. But again, just when we get this one track which might technically feel like a lower point in comparison to what surrounds it, there's 2 more big standouts to pick the energy right back up. Well, in a manner of speaking. I Just Want to Be With You is another one of the comparatively more laid-back tracks on the album, I guess. Although it's deeper and more watery synthwave-ish pads going up next to some airy pianos and whispery samples are underscored by a pretty driving house beat. Still allows this track to bang decently hard while also being one of the most deeply atmospheric cuts in the bunch. And then finally we hit the above mentioned I Know It's Stupid, another cut that takes the tempo down but also increases the heaviness of the beat work, and is most characterized by all these whoa voice samples around the edges that weirdly remind me of Sampha. It's probably not actually him, but the voice behind that sample just kind of reminds me of him, and that does really elevate the track, hitting yet another big and triumphant height. Alas, that is the end of what I consider to be the best stretch of the album, although that's only to say that I'm not getting repeatedly hit by standout after standout anymore. There's definitely quality to be found after this point. It just kind of becomes a little more scattered. Vibrations is a particularly interesting sounding cut with all these really fast-paced drum machine beats that add up to another fairly off-kilter effect, alongside some sharper synth pads and the usual vocal samples filling up the mix later on. Though I did kind of feel like a similar idea was executed a lot more impressively on the track I'm Taken, and this one didn't quite stick the landing in quite as striking a way. From there we hit a disco-flavored fake radio interlude Destiny FM, which is notable primarily for being pretty much the only point on the album that feels like it would effectively work as a stopping point for me, and a good place to put the rest of the album on hold and take a break to do something else. I didn't really have any other good stopping points before this because of how many standouts in a row there were and how smoothly all of them segued into each other, but that track at least signifies a break, and Christ, that will very much be necessary, especially given the album does sort of slide off for a little while after here, and will not be quite as consistently investing. Well, said slide-off doesn't happen right away, it's kind of more gradual. There are a couple more big standouts immediately after this point. Dance Now is a really triumphant and epic moment, building up all these wiry synth melodies and round bass lines over typically driving house beats over its nearly 9-minute running time, and eventually reaching this really hard-hitting, satisfying, and over-the-top payoff of flashy vocal samples at the end. That track keeps growing on me every time I put it on. Over You takes the energy back down, going back to a little bit of the acoustic guitar and auto-tune-y pop balladry, with more big flashy house beats acting as payoffs in between the more stripped-back sections of the track. Another grower, I'd probably say I enjoy it more than an earlier moment such as It's Still Me, but maybe isn't such a big standout for me to actively mark as a favorite. And then It Happened to Me brings the energy back up again with a kinda repetitive but still plenty addicting sample loop going over the typical house beats. This track kinda has a similar energy as an old track of hers like Wedding Night from Charmed. The idea is really simple, but it's nice and, satisfyingly low-end heavy with a good hook to back itself up. Although after this we hit my least favorite stretch of the album. The following 3-track run of Stay, Doubts, and Actions Speak Louder is consistently the part of the album that kept me the least invested. Now, all these tracks are still perfectly solid in a vacuum. They feature some decent enough hooks and maybe even slight growers, but they kind of hit me more on the level of, like, some of the middle-tier fillery moments from Charmed, like Not Your Fault or How Did You Know and all those. They kind of just deliver the usual formula without having either a striking enough twist in context or a solid enough hook to really stand out. Especially if I'm trying to listen to the album in one go, this is the part where I'm most likely to start to feel like I'm getting sick of the sound. If I took a break before that, then they're most likely to just, fall in the background and bounce off me. Again, all nice, but after so many tracks that have the same idea and structure and executed it even better and more memorably, it's hard to get enthusiastic about lesser cuts like those. The next 3 tracks are a bit more notable, although not to the point of entirely breaking this lull. Hey It's Gonna Be Okay goes for a more down-tempo approach again, with a few very light jazzy touches around the edges, like a little horn or keyboard lick in the background. I do notice this one anytime it comes up, although it doesn't really have a hook. Figuring It Out starts out with a really striking idea, going back to the regular straightforward vocal pop approach with a regular guest singer going over some sparser synth stabs of the Robin S. Show Me Love variety, and some garage-flavored beats. Although this track doesn't fully commit to its sparser idea and kind of has this big intense build-up in its second half that ironically makes the whole track stand out less. And then All I Can Feel goes back to the regular DJ Sabrina house formulas and is notable for having like 4 or 5 different change-ups and feeling like it's constantly shifting into some new ideas over the course of its nearly 8 minutes. Although it doesn't really have enough of a hook either and kinda ends up washing over me without me noticing on most listens. Though after this point we do finally start to get back on track. After a quick 20-second interlude in What's Your Favorite Artist that plays out exactly how you would probably expect from that title, we hit the first big standout in a while in Bewitched, which is one of the most formless and blurry mixes shown up to this point, but just hits you like a brick wall of sound. All these layers of pads and unintelligible samples and clattering 80s beats just feel so big and imposing, and really hits in spite of how barely coherent it is. Then we get this not really interlude Destined, which features a lot of spoken word going over some mild synth pop and new wave build-ups, and directly segues into Some Kind of Destiny, another straightforward vocal track which sounds really different from all the others. The falsetto-y male singer on this one kind of reminds me of like Panda Bear from Animal Collective or Kevin Parker from Tame Impala. Gives the whole track a different kind of like alternative indie pop flavor with its stripped back beats and keyboard instrumental, and the tune remains focused on that comparatively more straightforward approach just by, once again layering on more hooks and harmonies by the end. And then that takes us into the album's ending, which is pretty strong too. Without Crying / Without Hiding is, I believe, the longest track in the bunch at just under 10 minutes, but doesn't actually feel much longer than any other track here. It delivers another standard house mix in the usual formula, albeit one of the most investing iterations of it in quite a while. And right at the halfway mark, this track really cements itself as a favorite when this really obvious sample comes in. I immediately recognize it as a sample of a track I already knew, although it took me a long time to pin down what it actually was since it's being covered by a different singer, and it's a chorus being rearranged out of lines from the original song's verses. But on listen 3, it finally clicks that this track was pulling from Jackson Browne's Doctor My Eyes. Good taste in old school 70s singer-songwriters there, and really neat recontextualization of a classic track repurposed in a way that perfectly fit in the DJ Sabrina sound without feeling out of place. Great track, and makes for a satisfying placement as the album's last major banger. But the album finally closes with another 9-minute track in Slowdown, It's Never Too Late, which is equally as satisfying, fittingly starting out as this really down-tempo centric cut driven by a lot of synth organs and dream pop vocal layering. But building up in the typical DJ Sabrina way with a lot more layered vocal samples, including some that sound like they come from an actual Disney song. Possibly from like Beauty and the Beast or something, I don't know. I couldn't pin that one down, but it fits really well into the mix and provides a different sort of nostalgic angle to that typically magical feeling that this entire album is going for. Oh yeah, and there's also one little ambient interlude tacked onto the end of this track as a little bonus, so that's nice. But that is finally everything on Destiny. I think it goes without saying that this album is a lot. At nearly 4 hours, yeah, it's a bit much. It's guaranteed to be difficult to make time for. But at the same time, I went into this album expecting to, maybe keep a handful of tracks and ditch the rest. I was expecting that length was going to be way more grueling than it actually turned out to be. And I ended up feeling this time I might actually keep the entire thing. Yeah, there are tracks here I like way more than others. And if I'm being honest, I think there are 2 individual tracks on Charmed, which I still probably enjoy more than any of the 41 tracks on here, being I Want You to Know and End of an Era. But I'd return to the lowest points on this album in a heartbeat over even most of the middle tier tracks on Charmed. And the highest points on this album can not only come really close to those 2 highest points on Charmed, but there's so much more of them. There's so much more variety, so many more memorable hooks, and there's a greater emotional depth to this album that really wasn't there on previous DJ Sabrina projects that I'd heard. It's like that teenage DJ has finally become an adult now and gained the ability to convey the weight of having more, like, real-life experiences now. It's just such a noticeable level up across every department. I suppose time will tell on how often I end up coming back to this. I suspect the length alone is once again going to put a limit on how much replay value I end up getting out of it. And if I didn't already know that a sizable chunk of my most dedicated viewer base is already a lot more enthusiastic about this artist's work than I am, I'd still be kind of unsure on how easy this album would actually be to recommend to people just because of how freaking much it demands out of the listener. But I also know that a lot of people who regularly watch my videos are the kind to really uprate projects like Outakers NTS sessions. So when I say that I felt like the 4-hour running time actually was mostly justified this time around, I think that recommendation is going to more than speak for itself. I don't know yet if this is going to be like a proper year-end list contender, but at worst it's almost certainly going to end up as like an honorable mention or something. I really didn't expect to get into this as much as I did, and I was really impressed by all of it. This was great. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.
Yes.